In this video, I want to make contemplative prayer as simple and practical as possible. Most people overcomplicate contemplative prayer because they think they're supposed to silence every thought or feel close to God or have some kind of deep spiritual experience. But that really is not the heart of it. The heart of contemplative prayer is actually much simpler and ironically for most of us, much harder. You see, contemplative prayer is the practice of becoming available to God. It is prayer as presence, prayer as consent, prayer as being with God, not just doing things for God. Now, I've been drawn to prayer for a long time. One of the early doorways for me was the 24-hour prayer movement. I loved prayer rooms. I loved the atmosphere of those spaces. I love the prayer stations and the prompts and the scriptures on the walls and the way you could kind of go from one thing to the next. And honestly, it made prayer feel more kind of approachable to me. It made prayer feel less like something boring that I had to do because there was always something new to do, a station to go to, a prompt to respond to. But over time, there was still something in me that knew prayer had to be more than just activity, more than requests, more than keeping myself spiritually busy. I wanted something deeper, something more intimate. And that is part of what eventually drew me towards contemplative prayer. Not because those other forms of prayer were wrong, but contemplative prayer began to teach me another side of prayer. Prayer is being with God in love. And that's really what this channel is about. Making the contemplative path simple and grounded and accessible for ordinary Christians who are hungry for a deeper life with God. So in this video, we'll talk about how to begin with contemplative prayer, what to do with the distractions, what to do when it feels boring, and how to know whether it is actually bearing fruit in your life. But before we get practical, we need a simple definition. Contemplative prayer is learning to rest in God beneath all our words, thoughts, and spiritual performance. Contemplative prayer is not mainly about saying things to God or thinking things about God, or even feeling close to God. It's learning to rest in God, to consent to Him, to become quietly present to the God who's already present to you. Psalm 46 says, "Be still and know that I am God." John 15 echoes this and says, "Remain in me as I remain in you." See, so this is not prayer as escape or shutting off your mind. It's prayer as abiding. It's prayer as surrender. Prayer as love. And that means contemplative prayer is also not about doing it perfectly. Thoughts will come and feelings will come. Distractions will come. That doesn't mean that you're failing or you're doing it wrong. In fact, the whole practice can be summarized in one simple phrase: just return. Just return. When your mind wanders, you return. When boredom comes, you return. When you feel nothing at all, you return. The point is not to have an impressive prayer time. The point is to become available to God. And so with that in mind, let's make this very practical. The first thing I would say is don't start with a heroic plan. Don't start with 30 minutes. Don't start by trying to become a mystic overnight. Start with just 5 minutes. And then over time, you may build towards 10 or 15 or 20 minutes, but don't begin by making the practice so ambitious that you avoid it. So here's a very simple way to practice. First, choose a simple prayer word. This could be, Jesus or Abba or mercy or peace. Whatever you'd like. The word itself isn't magic. It's a sacred word that expresses your intention to consent to God's presence and action within you. And so when you notice you're caught in a thought or feeling or memory or distraction, you just gently return to that word inwardly. We'll talk more on that in just a bit. But then second, choose a time and a place. It could be first thing in the morning or during lunch. It could be before bed. Although if you're like me, you may fall asleep pretty quickly. I like to exercise in the morning to wake myself up a bit and then practice. So either way, you choose a time and a place where you can be reasonably still. Then set a timer. And that matters because if you're like me, if you don't set a timer, you'll be probably checking the clock every 30 seconds. And then your whole prayer time becomes wondering how long your prayer time has been. So set a timer for 5 minutes. Third, sit in a grounded posture. Feet on the floor, hands open or resting in your lap. Comfortable but alert. You don't have to sit in some special position. You don't have to look especially spiritual. You're simply helping your body become present and still. Fourth, just take a few slow breaths. Not to manipulate yourself into some special state or to force calm, but just to arrive, to begin to be present. And sometimes I think of this as letting my body kind of catch up with my intentions. Because I often sit down to pray, but then internally I'm still moving at the speed of the rest of my life. So take a breath. Let yourself arrive. Fifth, you consent to God. And this is the heart of the whole practice. You're not trying to force an experience or climb your way into God's presence. You're opening yourself to God's presence and action within you. And this is largely by faith. You're just trusting that the Holy Spirit is at work. You might begin with a simple prayer like, God, I'm here. I consent to your presence and action within me. And then you just sit in silence. Sixth, when thoughts come, you just gently return. Not if thoughts come, when thoughts come, because they will. A thought comes, you notice it, you don't fight it, you don't judge it, you don't analyze it. You simply return to your prayer word. Whatever it is, Jesus, Abba. And then when another thought comes, you return again. And when another thought comes, you return again. That's not failure, that is the practice. Seventh, you end simply. You might end with the Lord's Prayer if you wanted, or you might end with a simple thank you. Or if you have time, I'd encourage you to just remain quiet for another minute before jumping back into your day. Let the silence kind of come with you. But either way, just keep it simple. Don't immediately kind of evaluate the whole thing. Don't turn it into a performance review. Just receive the time as a gift. As I mentioned before, the prayer word is especially important to understand because the prayer word is not a mantra that kind of forces your mind into silence. It's more like a handrail. Imagine walking down a set of steps and lightly touching the rail to steady yourself. See, that is the prayer word. When you notice you've wandered, you lightly touch the word again as a way of returning to God. And so the word is not the point, God is the point. I'd recommend not changing your word all the time because, again, you're not trying to think about the word or drag up a lot of feelings. It's just a way of returning. And so the whole practice can be summarized very simply. Be with God, notice when you drift, and then gently return. That is contemplative prayer at its simplest. But this is where almost everybody gets discouraged because the moment you sit down to be silent, your mind will not feel silent. And if you don't know what to do with that, you will assume you're doing something wrong. So understand that thoughts and emotions are normal. Distraction is not failure. The return is the practice. And actually just sitting still without all the distractions of our world is such a foreign experience for us that you probably will have all sorts of random stuff come up. And Thomas Keating called this the unloading of the unconscious. And it's perfectly normal. I want to say that again because it may be the most important line in the whole video. Distraction is not failure. The return is the practice. You can imagine it as like sitting beside a river and watching the boats float by. Each boat is a thought, a memory or a worry or a regret, a desire. And so you can see the boat coming down the river, but you don't have to climb into the boat. You don't have to push the boat away. You don't have to judge the boat. You simply notice it, and then you let it pass, and you return to God. So maybe you sit down for prayer and suddenly remember an email you forgot to send. That's a boat. So you notice it and you return. Maybe you start replaying a conversation from yesterday. That's another boat. Maybe anxiety rises in your chest. That's a boat. Maybe boredom or sleepiness shows up. Again, that's another type of boat too. And you just return. And speaking of sleepiness, honestly, there are mornings when I sit down to practice contemplative prayer and I'm tired. Sometimes I will actually start to fall asleep, and then I'll do that little kind of jerk thing where you suddenly wake back up. And I used to think, well, there goes that prayer time. I ruined it. But now, honestly, I kind of just grin at myself because I imagine it like a child falling asleep in their parents' arms. The parent isn't offended. God is not shaking his head at me. The parent isn't sitting there saying this child is terrible at being held. The parent just enjoys holding them. And so when I wake back up, I simply return to God. No shame, no self-criticism, just return. Now that doesn't mean sleep should become the goal of prayer. It just means that even your weakness can become a place of trust. Because again, the point is not to impress God with your attentiveness. The point is to be with God as you actually are. If that one idea takes some pressure off prayer for you, be sure to like this video so more people who are overthinking prayer can find it too. But even if you understand that distractions are normal, there's still one more place people get stuck. They sit for 5 minutes and they feel bored or restless the whole time. And they begin to ask, did that even work? What am I doing? And so we need to talk about boredom, restlessness, and how to measure the fruit of contemplative prayer. Because you don't judge the success of contemplative prayer by how it felt. Some days you may feel peace. Some days you may feel bored. Some days you may feel restless. Some days you may feel like nothing at all happened. And that doesn't mean that the prayer failed. And this is important because many of us are still trying to use spiritual feelings as evidence that God is near. If I feel peace, then God was near. Or if I feel moved somehow, then God was near. And if I don't feel anything, then maybe God was far away. But that's not a reliable way to measure prayer, because God's presence is deeper than your ability to feel it. And God's action is often deeper than your ability to notice it. And so sometimes contemplative prayer feels boring. And I don't think we need to pretend otherwise. When you first sit still, there may be a part of you that immediately wants something to happen. You want insight, you want peace, you want God to give you something that proves the time mattered. But sometimes what rises to the surface is just restlessness, or the urge to check your phone, a desire to get up and do something useful. And this is where contemplative prayer becomes deeply formative. You see, because boredom reveals how addicted we are to stimulation. And boredom is kind of like us detoxing from the busyness of the world around us. It reveals how uncomfortable we are with stillness, silence. It reveals how quickly we assume that if nothing exciting is happening, then nothing important is happening. But love often grows in hidden and ordinary and unspectacular spaces. A marriage is not built only on the intense moments. A life with God is not built only in the moments where you feel spiritually alive. Sometimes love is formed simply by staying, by being there, by showing up without needing to be entertained or moved, productive or impressed. Henri Nouwen wrote in his journal about spending an hour in a Carmelite chapel. And he said it was not usually an hour of deep prayer. It was not a time when he experienced some kind of special closeness to God. He said it was often full of distraction and inner restlessness and sleepiness, confusion and boredom. And then he said something so important. He said, "But the simple fact of being for 1 hour in the presence of the Lord and of showing Him all that I feel, think, sense, and experience, without trying to hide anything, must please Him. Somehow, somewhere, I know that He loves me, even though I do not feel that love as I can feel a human embrace, even though I do not hear a voice as I hear human words of consolation, even though I do not see a smile as I can see a human face. Still the Lord speaks to me, looks at me, and embraces me there, where I'm still unable to notice it. The only way I become aware of His presence is in that remarkable desire to return to that quiet chapel and be there without any real satisfaction." See, that is such a freeing picture of prayer. Because the fruit was not that the hour felt satisfying. The fruit was that he kept returning. Something in him kept desiring to be there. And maybe that is one of the first fruits of contemplative prayer. Not that every prayer time feels meaningful, not that every moment is perfectly peaceful. Sometimes boredom is simply one of the places where desire is being purified. We're learning to stay with God when there is no immediate reward. Just love, just presence, just return. The fruit of contemplative prayer often shows up later. Not while you're sitting in silence, but in the normal flow of life. The practice doesn't end when the timer ends. The same return you practice in silence becomes the return you practice in traffic or in anxiety or in conflict. In ordinary life. You become less reactive. You become more aware of your attachments. You become less driven by image management. You become more able to receive the present moment just as it is. You become more rooted in God in an age of noise. That's why contemplative prayer matters so much. It trains us in presence rather than performance. And so the fruit of contemplative prayer is not that you become good at silence. The fruit is that love begins to reshape the way you live. So let's make this very concrete. If you want to begin this week, don't start with a heroic plan. Start small enough that you can actually return to it. Start with 5 minutes a day for 7 days. That's it. 5 minutes, 7 days. Same time if possible. Same place if possible. Choose one prayer word and then set a timer and just be with God. Notice when you drift and then gently return. And when the timer ends, don't evaluate it. Don't ask, was I good at that? Ask something much simpler. Did I show up? Did I consent? Did I return? And that's enough. And once you begin practicing this, don't be surprised if silence reveals how noisy your inner life actually is. That's not a sign you're doing it wrong. That may be the first sign that you're finally noticing what has been there all along. Because contemplative prayer doesn't happen in a vacuum. You know, when we begin practicing silence, we often discover how anxious and distracted and restless we really are. And again, that's not failure, that's awareness. And awareness is often where healing begins. You know, contemplative prayer teaches us to return to God in silence. And so then the next step on the contemplative path is vital. You know, we have to learn how to abide in God and take this practice into the middle of our ordinary anxiety and noise and daily life. So the next video I would watch is this one, where we talk about how to abide and why anxiety may actually be a warning light inviting you back to God.